All right, welcome everybody. Again, if you haven't done so already, please check your audio, turn your video on, and type in the chat box your name, role, and school or network you're with. We are going to go ahead and get started just to make sure that we stay on time. On the screen, you'll see session materials for today. So if you do not have it out already, the participant guide was in the email that I sent, as well as in our Google folder, and I'll make sure to drop it in the chat box also. If you brought one scope and sequence with you, we're going to work through that so we can make sure that we are all on the same page as we're working with our staff on modifying scope and sequences as it relates to our priority standards. And then as always, your school reopening tool, whether that be the one that you're using that City Forward Collective created or a different one, please make sure you just have that handy when we dig into some planning. As a reminder, I'm Melissa Caponegro. I'm the Director of the Quality Schools Initiatives here at City Forward Collective. On the call today, you also have Jadibel Rodriguez and Stephanie Manny who are with us. We are here to support in any way possible, so feel free to send us an individual chat message or just reach out to the group if you need any support. We are happy to help and just want you to know that we are all on the call. As a reminder for who we are at City Forward Collective, we are working to ensure high quality education for all students and families in Milwaukee. And we do that through 4 pillars of work: family and community organizing, community informed policy, effective and representative talent, and strategic investments in quality schools. As we move forward with our session today, the norms remain the same. So we love that you're on video. We love to see your faces. It's a great way to interact. Use the chat as much as possible. Again, you can chat us individually or as a whole group. Jump in with questions. We've said a million times that no one has the right answer right now. We're in this together. So please make sure you're asking questions and reaching out, and we will work through this process as a team. Mute yourself unless you're giving a verbal response, just so we don't hear the background noise. And as always, remember that we are better together. That goes in with the jumping in with questions. Again, there is no right or wrong answer. There are no experts as we navigate this new normal. So please, please, please know that we're in this together, and the work that we're doing is really here to support and make sure that your lives are less stressful through this process as we work through it together. And with that said, the objective for the overall series is to support schools and districts and staff members with preparing their plans for the 2020-2021 school year. And so at the end of these sessions in August, we hope that you walk away with a clear plan as it relates to educational programming. And again, my nice little picture of better together, so we don't forget that it is okay no matter where you're at in this journey. And we will get to finalize those plans as we work through these sessions. So before we get started, I want to make sure we take a moment to rename ourselves. For some reason, that beautiful picture that I had up here that was image of, I don't know, it just didn't work. That's okay. That's okay. The model of how we want you to rename yourselves today. We are going to be breaking off into grade level groups. So put a 1 in front of your name for elementary, a 2 for middle, and a 3 for high school. But as you're doing that, if you could also put the network that you're with. If you're a school that is a standalone school, it's okay just to put your school name. But if you are with a network, please put the number, the network, and your first name, similar to what I have on my screen, so that when we're in these breakout sessions, we know who is working together, and we can make sure that we're breaking up appropriately. Today, from your feedback, we read that many people would love to have more time in grade level groups, and so we will make sure that we provide that today. And then also we continue to hear that you'd love time with your school teams. So although that's not an option for today's sessions, that will be an option moving forward. And so we want to just get used to renaming ourselves to make sure we know which network our school you're from. So again, go ahead and right click on your picture, or you can scroll over your picture and hit those 3 dots. When you hit the 3 dots, rename becomes an option. Go ahead and put a 1, 2, or 3 based on the grade level you're working with, the network and or school you're with, and your first name. We'll give you a couple seconds to do that. And as always, if you're unable to name yourself, it's okay. You can stay in the main session when we go into our breakout rooms, and I'll make sure to put you in the correct room. All right, well, with that said, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jessica and her team at TNTP.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all again. And I'm particularly enjoying seeing people's families today in all kinds of different ways. So I love a cute baby. I definitely interrupted a PD yesterday to ooh and ah over a baby. So if you have one of those, you can pull them out. We could all laugh. But we have some work to do. So we are talking today about instructional models for reopening. And we all got the news that you've all received some more guidance. So our working assumption from Thursday that we are going to continue to make decisions as we can and figure out what we have control over as we get guidance continues to be true. Before we dive into this session though, I did just want to take a minute to share out the feedback we got from Thursday, because we did commit to sharing that. And I don't have a slide today. So Melissa, if you could give us like the quick highlights, like what did people like about Thursday? What did people want differently? So folks that were there know that we got that.
Absolutely. Like we've said, we take your feedback very seriously, and I'm excited to report that we had 25 responses for our second session versus 19 for our first, and I hope we have all 57 today for our third session. But really excited to hear that many of you had clear takeaways about acceleration versus remediation, and since that was the focus of that session, we're excited to hear that that was clear to you and you're looking forward to bringing it back to your team. We also saw that 100% of participants agreed that this reflected a need right now in the current space that you're at. And so that's really important, because if we're holding these sessions and they're not getting to a need you have, then we need to know that. And so it's exciting to know that it is meeting a need for all of you. Some of the things that you'd like to see worked on, which I mentioned a little bit before, is just more collaboration with school teams and or grade level teams. And so we're going to implement a little bit of that today with the grade level teams. We are continuing to work on logistics with school teams as well, so that we can make sure that we're having those conversations. And then also the feedback that breakout time is short, because we're only in there for about 15 minutes. We know that's not a ton of time for everyone to share. And so we'll work on some ways of maybe, minimizing the breakout sessions so that we can have more time in them and make sure that you all have time to share out. But other than that, we're excited to hear that, we're on the right track with this series, and your feedback again is extremely important. So please, all 58 of you now, make sure that you fill it out at the end of the session.
And Melissa, when you say fill it out, you send them the link to the survey before we're done, right?
Yep, okay.
Right
in the chat box.
Great.
You don't have to stay on to fill it out, but as long as you stay on your computer to fill it out, that'd be great.
Great. All right. So we are going to continue today to work with what we know, think about what's within our locus of control, and just a reminder that this group has found it most helpful when everybody shares. So as Melissa reminded us, this is a safe space. Some people have fully formed plans, some people just have some ideas, and we have everything in between. Everyone is just responding to new guidance. And so what are you going to do to make sure that this time is useful to you? And what are the ideas that you want to put out there to your colleagues and peers across the city to be able to say, here's what I'm thinking, what do you think? We want this to be that place where you can do that. The reason we're splitting out into grade levels today is because so much of what we're talking about is academics. And we found in doing these sessions that it's helpful for folks to be at the same grade level, and then also to be with folks who have the same curricula can be helpful too. So as that comes up in your groups and you want to make those connections across schools, please raise that or let us know so we can support you in sharing best practices as well. One last note about today, we're going to have like I don't know if you ever did with your students, like a brain switch where you have to do like one random thing with the other thing, and you just say like, okay, tell your brain it's crazy switch. We're going to have a brain switch today. We're going to talk about instructional models, and then we are going to adapt to scope and sequence. I'm just saying up front, these things are not like, there's not a through line, but we had put that in it's very important that we adapt scope and sequences, and we put that in the scope and sequence for you. So we didn't want to skip over that, but based on the conversations we've had and how responsive we want to be, we did want to spend time just talking about instructional models. So that's the reason for the brain switch later. So we are going to ground our discussion today in the principles that TNTP recommends for remote learning. And we have a resource about at-home remote learning that if we haven't shared with you, we can definitely share with you. It's you can find it online. But when we did the pivot in March from brick and mortar to remote learning, TNTP came up with this guidance, much of which I'm sure will be familiar with you. Take 30 seconds to review it. And then if everybody could chat, one of these 5 things that you used with your school in the spring. So once you look at those 5 principles, just a quick chat that says we continued with our curriculum, or we focused on reading, whichever one of these principles you all kept alive at your school in the spring. Started. Great. A lot of clear and simple, using platforms we'd already used. Great. Using data to identify students. Yes, and so important to be honest about the capacity and needs of your staff. Great. Thank you all for sharing that. So I'm sure with all of the things that you did that align to these principles, we probably all had some stuff we want to do better. And that's what we are going to dig into today. So today we're going to talk about planning for different instructional models. Thursday, we're going to talk more about the technology and operational part of that. But today we're thinking more about how do I decide what my model is, or if I've already decided or I've already been told what my model is, how do I figure out how to keep these principles alive given the model that I need to have? We are going to look at some examples of remote learning from across the country as examples, do some planning for instructional models, and then as I said, we'll dive into scope and sequence. So this continues our conversation from last week on learning acceleration and loops back to our guidance we had talked about earlier in planning. So we're going to start by evaluating some existing plans against these 5 principles. So what you see on my slide, you also have in your handout, because I know last time I saw a lot of people squinting and wanted to make sure you could also see it. This is an example from Success Academy, which is a large charter management organization in New York City. They came out with this plan, I think just last week. And so they shared publicly the plan. So if you want to dig into the details, it's available. But I pulled this one because I thought it was a nice example of a school that lays out very clearly what's going to happen on campus and what's going to happen on a remote day. So you might know that in New York, where I am, the guidance from the city and potentially from the state, there's still not official, but what we think is going to happen, students are going to go to school 1 to 3 days a week generally. And they're doing that because we're trying to get in-person back, but you can't have all the kids in a school, an overcrowded school, so they have to have a third to up to sometimes 50% of the kids. So that is the space limitation that has informed much of this planning, which is some days on, some days off. So take a minute to read through this, and then we're going to talk through a couple of questions. So I'll stop talking for 30 seconds so you can look at this. Again, it's here and in your handout if that's easier to see. Sorry, virtual classroom is VC. And I know that we don't know everything about their model, so we're going to work on some assumptions here, but just to give us an actual example someone's using to work from, how do you see this schedule keeping it simple? Like, what are they doing that you assume is probably keeping it simple?
Largely, they're following the same schedule, both in person and in distance learning.
Thanks, Melissa. And where do you see they might be using what they were already using? Where do you see evidence that something they used in school is also something they're using in this plan or in remote learning? Yes, and Courtney makes the point, the similar schedule will create stable learning environment for students.
I'm also seeing use of similar literacy skills from on campus to remote learning.
And Phil, what do you think the impact of that will be?
I mean, really just like a familiarity and consistency for both students and teachers to, kind of ease that, the transition or the contrast between virtual and in person.
And how do you all see this schedule as considering the capacity and needs of the staff?
To me, I noticed like in the virtual version, they're alternating. I mean, it looks to me like, so they'll have a little bit of virtual, but then they're maybe for the teacher, it's prepping for the next one. And for the student, they aren't like logging in back to back. And that's like, that seems helpful, to keep things rolling and not have these gaps.
Thanks. And how does this schedule prioritize reading?
Reading is a huge part of this schedule. So like they have literacy in person, they also have a read aloud, and then there's like a continuation of their independent learning in virtual.
Yeah, great. So, sorry, narrating my responses to the chat. Yes, also happening in the morning. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to break into smaller groups so more of us can discuss. And Erin and Paul and I are going to just lead you through some questions to dig a little deeper into this. So we are going to talk about, what do you think are the values and principles that are driving the school's reopening planning? So you think back to 3 sessions ago, we said, what is our vision, or what is your vision to ensure that your remote or hybrid planning still abides by the same mission and vision you have for your school? And that is a really important question for us to highlight, because we, to be very clear at TNTP, we are not saying you should do it one way or the other. We want to support you in doing it in the way that supports your vision. And we're doing that by looking at some examples to really examine how these folks are doing it so we can bring that learning back to our own schools. So Melissa, we are ready when you are.
All right, we're all set to go. Just a reminder, if you were unable to name yourself, just stay in the main session and I will make sure that you get in the right session. And also, I just want to make a quick plug and reminder. It came up at our last session on Thursday, just about sharing with one another that in these breakout rooms, I know this whole virtual world can be uncomfortable and getting in a discussion, but again, there's no right or wrong answers. And the more that we can share with one another, the more that we can learn and make these plans. So, all right, enjoy everybody.
All right, I'd love to hear from the groups. What were some of the takeaways the group had about this schedule for their own schedule? If you guys got there. If you didn't get there, just share out a takeaway about this schedule. Why don't we start with the elementary group?
We had some discussions around whether or not, how often it was live instruction and how often teachers would have a pre-recorded option for students and what that would look like based on students that need to be in childcare, the families that have first, second, third shift workers, you know.
Yep. And what was ultimately your thinking or recommendation on that?
We discussed the office hours idea and having a balance of some live options and then some recording that live instruction and then meeting up with the child more on small group or one-to-one basis on an alternate time.
And how about from the high school group? What were some of your takeaways?
Aaron Shapiro, you should get to call on somebody.
No, you know what? I'll just take this one, Stephanie. I'll act like you called on me. You know, I think one of the big takeaways was one of the things that came up at the very end was that a lot of times the high schoolers were not logging in until much after the regular day of school would end. A lot of times it was out of necessity. Either the student was working or they were helping younger siblings, or there wasn't enough bandwidth capacity within the household for the younger kids and the high schooler. So how do we accommodate that and take that into account when we're talking about both synchronous and asynchronous instruction, so that we're not penalizing students who are just simply unavailable during a particular time that's convenient for us to be participating?
Great. I think that resonates with the middle school group too, Erin, so thank you. Erin, did you all come to any decisions about that or recommendations? Where did you all get in that discussion?
So it was a lot of deep thinking that we came up with at the very end. You know, but some of the suggestions that were out there was like, you know, creating opportunities for students to demonstrate evidence, and regardless of whether or not they're in that synchronous phase, that they have the knowledge base and have the ability to show that they know or understand a particular content or skill.
And just to lift up that idea, we want to be thinking about all of our stakeholders, everyone in our community. So what is the student's role? What is the parent's role? What is the teacher's role? And then thinking, what are we doing to make sure everyone can operate at their best if we are and are not fully in person? Because we will come to the middle school group now. We were talking about what is the teacher's responsibility if the middle or high schooler can turn in their work up until, you know, midnight. We don't want the teachers to feel like they have to stay up till midnight. Like, nobody wants that. But then what are the structures we put in place in the schedule so the teachers can maybe start their day the next morning and check the work, so students who have other responsibilities have the freedom they need, but teachers aren't working 24/7 like we know so many teachers were doing when we pivoted because we didn't have these structures in place.
Hey, Jessica.
But I'd love to, Yeah.
Can I just add that I think that's why it's so important that to have like close contact with students and families in terms of making sure, you know, it's like there's a relationship between teachers and parents and families so that we are helping kids maximize their like good work habits and the best time to do that. For some kids, that may be doing it, you know, after 9 p.m. after their little siblings have went to bed. Some other kids might spend the whole day playing video games, and we don't like we want to encourage different habits with them, right? And so that's why it's just so important to have those relationships and close contacts so that we're helping them do the best they can and making good choices.
Poor teenagers. I gave that same example of the video game playing child who had nothing to do all day but play video games and then did their work. Not that any of us were ever like that when we were teens. And then from our middle school group, Lisa, could I call on you to share out just some of what we talked about?
Sure, we had similar issues as the high schools group, with students just wanting to do work when it was best for them, which totally makes sense. So kind of fronting the day with some synchronous learning and then allowing for a rest of the day, whatever that ends up being for a middle schooler, to work on their work independently. And then starting the following day, like that next Tuesday, with like an 8 a.m. teachers review the work from the day before, so that teachers aren't feeling like they need to look at the work that same day that it's getting turned in, but rather the next day to give kids that full day to work on stuff. And then one-on-one check-ins also, I think, are really important to start the day so that they can start the next day getting that feedback from the day before.
Yeah, and we talked too about that accountability. And I think that conversation in our group started from this discussion of student agency, because the way the Success Academy remote learning is built, that remote day, we can pull this back up, that independent literacy time is about having elementary school students have time to have their agency and lead their own work. So yes, that is, we agree that that does not work for an older student or a student that doesn't have the supports during that time, and you might want to move that time. But I do want to make sure this idea of student agency and student independence is part of all of our plans. So what are we doing to both set clear expectations for students and hold them accountable so they can build those work habits Paul was talking about as well. So that was a hybrid elementary example. Oh, some learnings I just want to make sure we talk about. Generally, our guidance is that we prioritize the in-school time for collaborative work, feedback, the socio-emotional learning, the relationships, and the small group instruction. When we look at this Success Academy model, though, I think we see that some of that's happening in both. So none of these are hard and fast rules. Like morning meeting happens no matter what the setting to maintain that sense of order for kids for their day, and that we see some of that more fun stuff after school programs happening and typing happening in both days. But when you're thinking about how do we figure out what to do in school time, these are some of the ways that we want to think about it. If we are in a hybrid and potentially going to fully remote, that's where we want to think about what are the things we need to teach our students and our teachers that they don't know yet that we wish we taught in the spring. A bunch of you already shared that you were using the platforms in the spring that the kids already knew. That was great. If that is not a situation your school is in, then you want to use the in-person time as well. Consider using that to teach kids how to use hybrid, how to use the online, and if you're fully online, building that time in to teach them any systems, just like we would any system in the regular school day. So now we're going to dive into a sample secondary schedule that's fully remote. So we just looked at hybrid elementary. Now we're looking at fully remote secondary. You have this on your handout. It's grayed out on my slide here. But I did want to also bring us back to the suggestion TNTP has around how many hours per day students should be doing work. I think we all probably have stories about what was too much or not enough for our students. So again, this is not a hard and fast rule. But this is more of a recommendation if you find yourself wondering how many hours could we actually consider for our students. I think especially K-2, moving students fully online 6 hours a day is really hard. So we have them for less time. So take a minute to look at your handout and look at this schedule. And we're going to go back into small groups to talk about how this schedule could inform our the scenario planning tool you all are using. There are some different considerations in this schedule, and in full context is that this schedule was from the spring, so it was a little different than it might be now. But again, actual recommendation based on research, really thinking through each of the components we talked about before. So Melissa, when you're ready, we're going to go back into our small groups to discuss this schedule. All right. I'd love to hear just like quick highlights for my facilitators, and then we're going to move on to just looking at one more schedule. Paul, let's start with you all. What were some takeaways for high school? Because this was a high school schedule.
Yeah, I really liked one of the participants, I can't remember her name, who said that the advisory optional piece was something that was very interesting just because of it being so important to make sure we have those daily touch points with kids, and that advisory is doubly important when we can't be together all the time. So I thought that was very interesting, and just other piece of making sure that the schedule is and resources are very transparent to families and students so they can support, because normally in high school, a lot of times we can more often rely on contact with students, but having to keep in close contact with families becomes even more important in a remote environment.
Thanks. And Erin, what were some of the elementary school takeaways from the schedule?
Most recently, we were talking about opportunities for the students to still be connected with their friends and their teachers, and how important it is to build in that time in the schedule so they know and it's predictable when they're going to have the chance to see their friends, and build that community and build that relationship. And then something else that came out for our group was how important the platform is that we're using when we're asking students to do work independently. The platform Seesaw was mentioned as being preferable in terms of teachers being able to upload videos and students being able to work right in the platform and send that work back to teachers.
Great. And Paul and I will talk more about that on Thursday. Yeah, the other thing that we talked about in the schedules, we also talked about the advisory, but the idea that the top is for districts and schools and the bottom is for students and families. So just thinking about those expectations, making sure they're clear to everyone, and also thinking how are we maximizing the time everyone has together or apart, and making sure that it's clear. And Angela made a really great point around just like saying, it's like, we expect you to go get lunch, like kids, families, teachers, go get your lunch during this time. And that's part of building student agency, and that's part of just respecting everyone as professionals. So we are going to look at we're going to look at the schedule quickly and all together, because I want you to think about everything we just talked through. This is an example of a schedule. It's a real schedule. In full transparency, I can verify that it is an actual schedule that someone I know, perhaps myself, was working with. A school with wonderful intentions. How do we make sure that our students still have access to the rigorous content that they had in the school building? So this is the student-facing schedule for K-5. With everything we just talked about in your groups and what you know, what in this schedule aligns to some of the best practices we talked about? It's a real schedule, K-5. What in the schedule aligns to what we just talked about? Where do you see some of those principles in action?
Well, the teacher check-ins, the office hours, those are intentional ways for connections.
Screen breaks, yep. Yep, they were definitely using what they already had. They pretty much took their in-school model and made it remote. Yeah, so Luke just brought us into the other topic. Sorry, CKLA is a ELA curriculum. So it's a long day, longer than the hours we were just recommending. It's a lot of screens because all of it was synchronous. What are some other ways that you see it kind of falling short of what we just discussed? Yeah, and I think to this point in the chat about reading, sometimes we say like, when you're unsure, focus on reading. This school was intentional. Their reading and their math are as equally important, and they wanted to make sure in the way that they were equal in brick and mortar, they were equal online.
One thing that I'm getting kind of hung up on is like an hour on one subject. And I realize they're probably doing some other stuff, but really all the other stuff we saw kind of really broke it up or made it smaller, a smaller chunk to just dive in, get it done. But I mean, even from experience, I know if they're kind of working independently, they can probably get it done pretty quickly. So that just seems like a lot, which might just turn into a really long break if they don't stay engaged the whole time. Just a thought.
So
yeah.
The hour jumps out to me as well, but this is from a parent perspective. My daughter is in K4 and it would take almost 30 minutes to get all K4 students online. So I also worry about a classroom that only has 20 or 30 minutes scheduled for something that doesn't account for all of the other things that happen online, like the redirecting, the support, getting kids online, making sure. Now, as they've been doing it longer, hopefully that diminishes and you have less of that. But I wonder what is the sweet spot with the amount of time a lesson is going to take online versus the amount of time it takes in person. I always feel like things take longer online than they do in person.
Yeah, and that brings us to a really important point. And Angela, you got a lot of nods there. I think we have to make sure that whatever we're doing with our students and families and teachers, that we're teaching the system. So one strength of this school, they had very close relationships with families. Some of the classes had nearly 100% attendance every day on devices all day, which is hard. And this is a Title I school. These are families, many of whom are essential workers. And so they were able to do that because of the culture they had built with their school prior. Like, I don't think you could do that if people weren't bought into your school and your model. With that, it was hard. I was able to observe some of the classes. It's hard to keep kids' attention, to Kristen's point. And to Angela's other point, they had a co-teacher model. So one person followed up to make sure kids were logged on. So the teacher teaching was just teaching. I would just say, I don't think it should take 30 minutes to get everybody on. If it is, then you've got to figure out, just like you would any other system at your school, is it the teacher? Is it the time? Is it the families? Like, I'd want more information to figure out how to support families in doing that. But again, thinking about this, we can't just transfer our brick and mortar model to online or to hybrid. That alone isn't enough. We still want to keep the rigor of our instruction, but there's so many other things you all have just raised about why it's very difficult to just turn a 6-hour school day for K-5 into a 6-hour online day. Even when some of the things like devices and timing and all of that at this particular school wasn't an issue, there were still drawbacks to it. So I wanted to just give you another example. I mean, I know we just talked about what this was lacking, but I also wanted to make that point about you can't just transfer the schedule, because you all have to make your own decisions with what works best for you and your school and your community. So I think thinking through the pros and cons of some of these different options can help us to get there. So the last piece I want to look at before we go into our own planning.
Hey, Jessica, can I make one point as well?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think it's in terms of, I do appreciate schools who are really ambitious with their online learning model because they're trying to serve students as best they can. And I think it's always easier to pull back and take things away. And I would just warn people that if you start less ambitious, it's going to be harder to build on and ask people to do more. So I would just take that into consideration when you're building your schedule.
And Paul, you actually, by speaking, reminded me of something great that you did. Can you talk a little bit about the model lessons that you did to help the school?
Yeah, so no one really knew at my school this spring what online learning should look like. And so I took on the challenge of teaching an asynchronous lesson for a couple of different subjects and showing it to people and what it should look like. And I was really scared to do it because I had never done anything like that before. Put me in front of 50 high schoolers, I'd be fine. But and actually doing stuff yourself, trying that out yourself as the administrator, like you were a teacher, really helps you refine your vision for what you want instruction to look like and gives you better perspective and empathy for teachers as well. So it's a really beneficial exercise for everyone.
Thanks, Paul. And Paul really helped remind me, particularly when I was working with this school, that they never did model lessons. The administrators never tried it themselves. And I think if they had done some of that, it could have helped poke some of those holes in the plans to really decide, all right, this is hard, but as a school, we're sticking to it, or this is hard and we might want to change it because kids aren't with us for an hour. All right. I just want to do a quick bringing back to this conversation about stakeholders. So in your handout, you have some internal data from a survey TNTP did. I'd love for you to take a minute or two to review it. I just want to be clear that this TNTP has a survey, which we shared with you. We had schools around the country that gave it. This is weighted toward one district. I actually don't even know what district it is. So it might not be representative of your students in your community, but when I read this, many things resonated with me that I thought were helpful in terms of our planning. So I'm going to give you a minute to look at it without us talking over, and then we'll discuss it as a group. All right, so as a whole group, what stands out for you in some of this? What resonates or what surprises you?
It really resonated with me that 19% of the families were food insecure, that they weren't, that they might not be relying on the school for food, but that they would appreciate if their school could help them. I think we did your survey with our families, and I remember feeling relieved that none of our families felt that they needed food, but so many of ours wanted mental and emotional help. So for us, that number was much higher. They wanted help in that area.
The thing that resonated me was that first data point. 47% of students report having talked with their teacher a few times in the last week, while 95% of teachers say that they've communicated with their students at the same rate. I think that gap there is just down to unreciprocated communication. But that definitely resonated with me based on our experience in virtual learning.
Yeah, that one resonated with me as a parent, and some of you may have heard me say this before, that I got on video at one point with my son's teacher, and he said, "Oh, you are a family that at least I've been communicating with." And I thought, I had been thinking to myself, I'm glad we're finally talking to him, because we haven't talked to him at all this whole time. And in working with schools in the spring, just talking about how do you know, to Phil's point, that reciprocation happen, and what are we making sure you're really granular with teachers. Like, what does it mean to communicate with a kid? Does it mean you blast out something on Google Classroom to the whole class, or does it mean you've had a check-in? Does it mean you've talked to the parent about setting up the computer, or like how they didn't understand an assignment? Or does it mean you've had a one-on-one with a student to ask how they're doing? And I think that's really thinking about what your priority is for that teacher-student interaction when you're not in person, and making that really clear is going to be helpful for everyone. Yeah, and I think I'm just reading your comments, and even again, in my own experience as a parent, we all know it's the parents who are either the noisiest, speaking for my son's class, who ask the most things that are getting the help because the teachers were overwhelmed, especially in the beginning, or the parents that are MIA, that the teachers are really trying to reach out and figure out how they can support the family. So for the folks in the middle who are, trying to follow along and do the right thing and don't have tons of problems, but would help, I think at our school, that's who got lost. All right, so what we want to do now is move to your planning tool. All right, what we're going to do is move back into our breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And we want to go into our planning tools and add everything we've just talked about across the different scenarios. Now, there might be some of you in your group who you're like the person that owns the planning tool, you should type it in. If you're the person in your group that doesn't own the planning tool, but you have ideas, we can spend this time shooting an email to that other person or giving them the ideas. But what we want is that at the end of these 10 minutes, you have made any adjustments to your different models here based on what we talked about. So facilitators, we're gonna move back into our groups and we'll use this 10 minutes to make sure they have what they need. They can either use it as work time or as discussion time to have what they need to get into that planning tool. So Melissa, we can move in.
All right, welcome back, everybody.
I think our MO for this series should be never do nothing. Always do a lot of things at one time. Thank you to the few people left. Okay, so thank you for that. Our hope there was to bring you through that process so that you can go through that process with your teachers. Even since we started doing this series like 2 months ago with some places, so many things have changed. Like that student achievement partners guidance wasn't out. The guidance from different curricula wasn't out. So we've seen this process turn from something that we were spending hours with folks to, as we did here, potentially like less than 30 minutes, because if you already have the standards prioritized, so much of your work is done. And then it's just figuring out, looking at that year-long scope and sequence. And just to make that point, which I'm sure you guys talked about in your small groups, we encourage everyone, or we tell everyone, you've got to look at the whole year. You can't just look unit by unit, because when you're looking at those prioritized standards, you're going to have to prioritize and deprioritize over the course of the year. If you do it unit by unit, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot and not actually have the time or the wiggle room that you need. So you've got to make those decisions now. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Melissa to just talk about all the other stuff we're going to do coming up this week and next.
Yes, thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the team at TNTP for, again, another great session. I have no idea where time goes in these, and I don't know how it's 3 o'clock. But we will definitely move along so you guys are out of here on time. Just a reminder, our 2 sessions coming up, we have one on Thursday that is specific to creating schedules that align to tech support and really looking, again, deeper into those hybrid schedules. And so things that we started talking about today, we will do more of that on Thursday. The best people to be at that meeting on Thursday would be those who are in charge of the scheduling and really planning what schedules are going to look like in all 3 scenarios, in addition to that tech support and the person that's supporting families, ensuring that the tech support is where it needs to be once we start back in the fall, no matter what that looks like. And as a reminder for your schools and your planning teams, there only needs to be 1 representative here on this call. Obviously you can have more, but we don't want anyone to feel stressed out by attending all 9 sessions. And then next week, we just wanted to call out that we will again move into some operations and talent. So aligning staff to your model and what that looks like. And we will additionally have a session on Thursday as well. All Zoom links and information are sent every Monday and Wednesday from me. So if you do not get a Zoom link Monday or Wednesday, please let me know. All the resources are uploaded in our resource folder that is on those emails as well. And if you feel like you have additional team members that you would like to be at these meetings, please just shoot me an email and I can add them to the registration list so that they have that information. One quick note before I send the survey in the chat box is that you saw another email from City Forward Collective yesterday. If you're in elementary or middle school with an opportunity for a hybrid learning community, this opportunity is separate from our learning series. So I don't want you to think if you're in this series that you have to be a part of that as well. It's just another opportunity, an additional piece of support if you want to dig deeper just specifically into a hybrid model and what that looks like. Please take a look at that email and reach out to me with any questions, but I wanted to make sure that that note was in there, that it is not in connection with this series in terms of having to do that piece along with this planning series. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to email me or Stephanie or Jadi and let us know how we can support. I am dropping the survey in the chat box because that is how we know best to support you all. Please, please, please be honest with your feedback. I have to shout out one of the participants who had to leave early, came back to the main session during breakouts and asked for the survey before he left. So was really excited about that. So thank you for taking the time to do the survey. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you guys on Thursday.